Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to what could be the last calibration video for the Folger Tech Kossel 2020. Possibly the last one. I'm not entirely sure yet. If you need anything else after this, just leave a comment, and I might be able to make other videos. But this is gonna be the last big video in the series on how to set up and get everything calibrated and all that. So this is gonna be the slicer settings that I use. Now, before I get into this, one thing you need to know is, number one, I'm only going to show you the slicers that I use, which in this case happens to be the two that are built into Repetier Host stock, which are the Cura engine and slicer. If you happen to use a different program or use a different slicer, you're going to have to basically, translate my settings to whatever the settings are in those. Some settings they're different between all the different slicers. You may have some options in one and that option's not available in the other, this kind of thing, that kind of thing. Different slicers are better for one thing versus another, which is why I actually use slicer and Cura, both, depending on what kind of model I'm making. But for the most part, if you've been following this series and been using Repetier Host like I've been showing you, blah blah blah, then this video should help you to some degree. So anyway, open up your Repetier Host or whatever software you happen to use, and basically you just go over to where it says slicer right here, and you choose your slicer based on what you have picked here. So normally it's slicer is the stock one that it comes with, or the stock one that's picked first. The Skein one normally isn't there. I added that, although I don't actually have it installed, so it isn't really there to do anything. And then Cura engine is the other one that's usually in their stock. I do recommend both of those. Cura is a little bit faster and can do certain things a little bit better. To me, in my testing, it's been a little bit better for like overhangs and stuff like that, whereas my settings in slicer are a little bit faster. So if I'm just doing something small, I usually use that. So anyway. So let's start with slicer, just because it's the one that usually is the best to start out with because it has the most settings available to adjust. You just click the configuration button right here and just give it a second. Slicer is kind of slow in everything that it does. When you click configuration, it takes a while for the window to pop up, and it also takes a little bit longer to actually slice the model. So anyway, from here you're going to see all the different settings and what you can pick and all that kind of stuff. Now some of these settings I'm going to show you are just what I have it set at, specifically like the speed settings. Those are all kind of arbitrary numbers. They're kind of going to be up to you and what your printer is capable of, especially if you've built yours slightly different than mine, or if you have a different printer completely. So anyway, layers and perimeters is the first thing. Layer height, I just have it set as 0.25 millimeter right now. The first layer height is 0.2. Now the first layer height itself, you don't necessarily want to use what I have there. That is what my printer has been, it prints the first layer exactly as I need it to. The first layer is like the most important layer of your print. So you want it to lay out in a very specific way. You want it to lay out, to where it sticks well enough, but it's not too thin of a layer. And it kind of takes a little bit of adjustment, especially when you set your bed height. This is a good way to adjust that. If your bed height's a little too low or a little too high, adjusting the first layer height is actually a great place to kind of correct for that. A vertical shell is basically just the perimeters, like how many outer layers there's going to be before it's empty inside. If you have 0 infill, something like that. I just have it at 3, which works just fine. Horizontal shells is basically going to be how many layers, solid layers there are on the top and the bottom of the model. I have those both at 3. If it's something that I want to be pretty thin, I'll drop those down depending. The quality, which is slower slicing, this is just going to be a couple different quality settings. Most of these these are just how they were, I believe. Same with the advanced seam position. I suggest putting it at random because that's wherever, if you have an the outer perimeter, wherever it starts and wherever it ends should be in one specific spot. So if you do that all the way up a model, you might have a little bit of bulging along that seam, which is what the seam position is. If you have them all aligned, you'll see that. If you put it at random, then it kind of places it all around, so you don't get any specific spots where that's happening. So I kind of recommend random, but you can play around with this. Infill's totally up to you, all the different settings. The fill density I change all the time depending on the model, if I need it to be solid and strong or hollow and really quick. Rectilinear is what I use just because it doesn't use a whole lot of filament. The honeycomb one is really, really strong, but I don't really use it just because it takes a bit more filament. And of course the rest of these are just advanced settings. Most of those I haven't changed. Skirt and brim, I don't use the brim, but you can if you want, depending on what model you use. The skirt is basically a couple lines that it runs around the print before it prints to actually prime the nozzle. I do recommend you have that on and put it at a higher number than a lower number because you want the extruder to be fully extruding and primed up before it starts the print, or else you're going to not get a very good sticking to the bed if you're just instantly going into the model and it's not going to be printing the first half of the bottom just because it's not primed up and ready. So for example, you can have these kind of settings. So a couple loops, this is the minimum number of loops. Distance from the object, is going to be how far away it is. Skirt height, 1 layer is fine. You don't have to go any further than that. Minimum extrusion length, you can have that set to whatever number works out for you. I have the extrusion length, actually, this is 25 millimeter of filament, not of actual movement on the bed, so it actually will extrude like 6 or 7 loops, which is why I use this for smaller parts, because it, if you have a smaller part, it's only going to make smaller circles around it, so you want it to be a little longer to make sure everything's primed up. So that's why that's that. Again, these are kind of arbitrary numbers. You can put whatever works for you, but this is just what I know works. Support material, I don't really use support material unless it's absolutely necessary, and if I do, these are all stock settings. Speeds, this is where you can get into a lot of trouble if you're not careful, if you're not using the right settings. So perimeters, I have that pretty fast. You don't really want to go any faster than 120 millimeters per second on the Kossel specifically, unless you have everything tuned really, really well. If you go any higher than that, the motors start to kind of they don't really like to go any faster than that. But you can do it if you're careful. You can do it. That's why I have my travel speeds are 130, which you don't really have to go any faster than that. But perimeters, I have at 80. Small perimeters, which are small perimeters, have a 20. External perimeters are 70. Infill, I have fast. Solid infill is pretty fast. Blah blah blah, different things. Bridges, I've found that having a fairly low number, something like 35, does help a lot. With the actual bridges. I've tried going really fast, like 60 or 70, and I've tried going really slow, like 10 or 15, and I feel that 35 to 40 actually has the best print quality for bridges. I mean, my bridges are really, really good. Actually, I have one right here, and you can see that's a bridge. This is, I think, 40 or 50 millimeter, and this is barely bridging, or barely sagging right in the middle. It's not very much at all. And that was, before I actually dialed it in even more. That was just like a one I did a couple weeks ago. So you can get a really good bridging with this printer if you have everything dialed in correctly. Travel speed, 130 millimeters per second. First layer speed, that's the most important thing. Put a low first layer speed, 20 millimeters, 15 millimeters per second, 10 even. You're going to get a really, really good quality print if you have a low first layer speed. I've seen people try to put it up at like 100 millimeters per second and nothing wants to work because it's not sticking correctly. If you get that first layer down and stuck down really, really well, you're going to get a much better print in the end. So you really, really want that first layer speed to be on the slower side. You can go as high as 30 and still get good results depending on what it is. If I'm printing something really large, like this right here, I'll show you that later. This is like, I think it's 4 by 5 inches or so, or 4.5, 3, whatever. It's a kind of a larger print. I usually will bump that first layer speed up a little bit just so it doesn't take as much time, because that first layer usually takes the most amount of time for stuff that I'm printing. Acceleration control, I don't have the acceleration modified at all. In the slicer, I have that done through the firmware, through Marlin. Auto speed, I've never touched that. Leave it where it is. Multiple extruders, I don't have one of those, so none of that matters to me. Extrusion, all this is the advanced settings. I haven't really modified any of that as well. This is where you can adjust a lot of different things like flow for the bridge bridging, if you want to make it pull out more or less filament during bridges. That's something you can adjust. Different size compensations for X and Y and threads and resolutions. A couple other modifiers for extrusion width for different parts of the actual layers and perimeters, stuff like that. So the other two things I don't ever use, not really important. Filament settings is something you want to do. So for example, in the filament category, you want the diameter of the filament to be 1.75 millimeter if you're using the Kossel like I am. If you leave it, I think it might be at 3 millimeter stock, and if you leave it at 3, then you're not going to have a good time at all. You want that to be 1.75. Whenever you get a new roll, a new spool of filament, take a pair of calipers, just like these right here. These are the cheap $10 Harbor Freight ones. They will do more than enough for you when you're doing something like this. If you're doing stuff down to the 10,000th of an inch, these aren't the best for it, but if you just need in the ballpark measurements, a $10 pair of calipers like this will work. But then again, if you have a $150 pair of calipers, go right ahead. And you just want to kind of measure the filament, in a couple different spots to see where it is. I've had filaments in the past that they say that they're 1.75 millimeter, but in reality they're closer to 1.7 or 1.65 or something like that. And if it's a little smaller, then a little bit less filament's going to be extruded when it's pushing it through. So you want to get the diameter pretty damn close to what it actually is. So if you measure it a bunch of places on the filament and it says 1.7, put 1.7 in this, and it'll be able to extrude it a little bit more correctly than if you just left it at 1.75. I use Hatchbox filament, and that happens to be 1.75 all the time. It's great filament. I highly recommend that. Extrusion multiplier, if you are extruding a little more than you think you should, then you can lower this. By no means do you need to put it where I have it. When I last used Slicer, this is what was giving me the best quality prints, so that's why I have it set at that. And temperatures are also completely arbitrary. If you're doing PLA, then you want the extruder temperature to be somewhere in the neighborhood of between 185 to 200 degrees. You can go a little higher than that. I usually don't see any benefit to doing that. In fact, the lower the temperature, the better it is for bridging, because it's going to be able to cool down a little bit faster because it's not quite as hot to begin with. So I usually use 195 degrees in both Slicer and Cura. Except for the first layer, it's set at 200 in Slicer. Cura, I don't have it to do that. I just have it at 195 all the time. In the bed temperature, PLA, you don't really need a heated bed, but it helps. So I usually have it between 65 and 70 degrees. Again, that's, just in that area is usually good enough. You can go a little hotter or a little colder, and you should be fine. If you're using ABS, I don't use ABS personally, never have. But you will need hotter temperatures like 230 degrees for the extruder and somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 degrees for the bed. But then again, I'm not an expert in ABS. I don't use ABS, so don't take my word for that. And another thing I should mention is different colors may actually respond differently to different temperatures. For example, the black that I use likes to be in the 200 to 205 degree range to get a really nice quality print. Whereas other colors that I have, like the whites or even clear, tend to have better quality prints at lower temperatures, like 195 or 190. So different colors will want different temperatures. So keep that in mind and experiment around when you get different filaments and all that kind of stuff. Also, different brands of filaments will change. So there's no real easy way to just say, use this. You kind of want to experiment with quality and stuff like that and see what you can get. Cooling, biggest thing, especially for the Kossel, is have the keep fan always on. Always have that fan running. If you have it just like the stock one where the fan is just blowing on the fin tube in the middle, always have the fan on. If you have it like mine to where there's a double or 2-in-1 fan duct to where it's blowing on the actual print and the duct, you want to still have it always on. If you let the middle tube of this extruder specifically get too hot, then it's going to clog up everything, and you don't want to do that. That's not good. So just always have the fan on in here. And then a couple other things, there's this fan settings. If you want to install another fan that only does the print and you have this one just blow on the extruder itself, then you can set all that up, and this is where you can adjust stuff like that. Last thing is going to be printer settings. You can set the bed shape and Z offsets, and if you want to install Octoprint, if you have a Raspberry Pi, stuff like that, or run Linux, you can adjust it that way. Firmware, make sure the G-code flavor is set to RepRap, Marlin, Repetier. Everything else I've never really adjusted. The main thing you really want to look at is the custom G-code. So the custom G-code is going to affect how the printer runs at the beginning. So for example, I think I've talked about this in the Repetier video that was a couple before this one. But for example, in Slicer, I have it do G28, which homes all axes, G29, which does the auto level, and then it moves the nozzle to a certain spot. And then M190 and M109 both wait until the heaters are heated to their full extent. And then G92 E0 is what zeroes out the extruder, so it thinks it's at its zero spot. I don't have the EEPROM ones set up. If I wanted to activate EEPROM, I would actually go after the G29 and do M500, just like that. And that will store whatever the G29 data, the auto bed leveling data, into EEPROM. And I usually will also do M502, if I'm not mistaken. That will clear the EEPROM before the print. So that way when you save it again over after the G29, it doesn't interfere with anything that's already there. It'll clear it and then put in the new amount. You don't necessarily have to do that. If you have everything set up correctly, the auto bed should already do that. The auto bed leveling should work without you storing it into EEPROM, but that is a way you can do EEPROM if you want to do that. You just have to use M500 to store everything into EEPROM. And the last thing in Slicer is going to be extruder 1. If you have another extruder, then you'll have to adjust things. But the nozzle diameter for the printer, the stock, it should be 0.4 millimeter. Make sure it's set to that. It might not be that stock. 0.4 millimeter is the one that comes with the Kossel. You want it to be 0.4 millimeter or else things aren't going to go well. And then retraction, a couple other things. I have 4 millimeters length and retraction at speed 40 millimeters per second. Different things like this. You can just copy and paste what I have there if you want. But for the most part, this is really all you're going to need to worry about. The biggest things of the Slicer settings are going to be the nozzle diameter, the filament diameter, and then, just any other thing. Those are the main things that you need to set up for this printer specifically. Everything else is kind of up to you and what your qualities wants to be, stuff like that. So that was Slicer. Now I'm going to take a look at the Cura engine. I'm not going to go as in depth anymore because I already went over that once. But I do use that also. It's a lot faster to pop up. So speed and quality, these are all my settings. You can pause it here and just grab whatever numbers that you need. These all work. I use these and they work just fine. I do have the travel set at 150. Cura and Cura Engine are for the Ultimakers, which the Ultimakers are really high quality 3D printers, but they're stupid expensive. But they are capable of printing at 150 millimeters per second, no problem. Like all the parameters that fast. They're really awesome printers. But again, I don't have $3,000 to just blow on 3D printers all the damn time. So these are the settings that I use for the Kossel, and they print really, really well. You just grab whatever ones you need. For this one, I actually have it 0.2 millimeters for layer heights. And I just adjust it through here. You can adjust the extrusion width all through here, and that's just going to change a couple settings, blah, blah, blah. Structures, same sort of thing as Slicer. You have the shell thickness, which is going to be the shell thickness, top and bottom thickness, infill, overlap, infill patterns. You can do grids, lines, stuff like that. Support, which is going to adjust the support settings. Skirt and brim, again, skirt length. This is what you want to change. Although I do think in Cura, this minimum skirt length is actually the extruded amount on the actual on the bed itself. It's not by the amount of filament going in. So the last bit's going to be like the raft stuff, and if you're using a raft, just those are the settings. I don't ever use them. Of course, here, make sure that the G-code flavor is RepRap, and you should be fine in that regard. Extrusion, this is a couple of things here are important. Retraction speed and the retraction distance. I have those at 40 and 4 respectively. One thing you should know about Cura is Z-hop actually helps a lot if you have a lot of separate parts that it's moving between. If you have little like stringing lines between those parts, try adding a Z-hop. It's like 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters or so, and that'll lift up the head before it moves over, and you sometimes can get better quality that way. Also, cut off the object bottom. If you need something to be a little shorter or something slightly angled and you want everything to be on the bottom, you can use that, and it cuts off however much millimeters that you put off of the bottom. It just drags the whole model down slightly. Nozzle diameter, if it's 0, then it's using the printer settings. Multi-extruder stuff, I don't ever use cooling. I have it automatically on, so I just have everything at 0 and it leaves it where it should be. G-code also, it's the same as what I talked about in Slicer, so this one I actually have EEPROM enabled. So M502, then all that stuff. It's the same thing as what I showed you in the previous one. In advanced, I've never modified anything from here. The filament settings, again, another thing you want to make sure, filament diameter is 1.75 millimeter, and flow, you can adjust the flow rate if you need to. Temperatures, 195 and 70, because I use PLA. And then cooling, this is another thing, the cooling fan. That says the fan speeds are always running at 100. So one thing you want to know with saving your information is the filament section and the print section are 2 different settings. So if, for example, I'm saving something in the filament setting, I'll save it here, name it whatever, and I'll have Kossel to choose. And when you're over here in the actual slicer, the filament is in the filament settings, so this is where you'll adjust that. But if you're also in the print settings, like all this, then you'll want to save it, and I have a couple different settings depending on what kind of print I'm doing, and that's adjusted with this one right up here. And so you just want to keep an eye on that there's 2 different ones. So if you're changing something in the filament setting but you're not actually changing it here, that's why things aren't going to be working. Other than that, the adhesion type, if you need to add a brim or a raft, you can add it right here. Quality, you have to actually set those. So if you want to add a layer quality, you would simply just go over here, change the name right here, and then the layer heights or whatever, and then just hit that add button, it'll add it right here. I didn't change the name, which is why it's identical, but that's what this is right here. And then of course, if you need support, you can have a couple different kinds of support. And of course, when you see these speeds, you have a slow and a fast. You can adjust that right here, just between slow and fast, and it'll automatically adjust your speeds. And then of course, infill density, that's where you change the infill. And of course, enable cooling, just always leave that on, and you shouldn't have any problems. So that's the basics of the slicer settings that I use for my Kossel. They could be slightly different for you. If you're just gonna have to kind of adjust and try out different settings. I mean, I'm still trying out settings all the time with mine, so these might not be the same thing as what I'm using next week or something like that. Just improving things, and some models like certain settings. It all kind of depends. So this is a good baseline for getting you printing, but yeah, just use these as a baseline, but don't take them to heart. So just keep adjusting around things, and as long as those printer specific settings are correct, you shouldn't have any problem, and you can go as crazy as you want with the other settings. So anyway, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully it helped, and if anyone wants another video made of some other thing, or just comment, and I'll either respond to you there, or I'll make another video if there's enough demand for it. And I hope you've all enjoyed this series, and I'll look into some other things. If I feel a video needs to be made, I'll go ahead and do that. But I hope this all helped, and if you need to contact me, comment, Twitter, I'm on there. You can message me there, and all the other kind of stuff. And subscribe if you like these videos, because 3D printing, is going to happen here. Some news, some things I have in the works will be coming in a later date if you're interested. So, if you subscribe, you'll be able to follow me and all that kind of stuff. So, anyway, thanks for all for watching, and I'll see y'all later.